So I'm Ad Neeleman. I'm professor of linguistics and I study human language. My big research question is about knowledge of language. I'm interested in what someone knows if they know a language. It's a kind of interesting question because we're interested how humans function. And it's also a relatively easy question to research in certain respects because language is all around, so the data are everywhere, if you see what I mean. That question about what do people know when they know a language should really be distinguished from two other questions that people at UCL are working on. One is how do people use their knowledge of language when they speak, and how is knowledge of language implemented in the brain. Those are not things I work on. I work only really on the content of the knowledge. So the main thing that I'm working on within that larger question is word order. And what we're trying to find out really is what are possible and impossible human languages. And the idea is if we understand better what are possible and impossible human languages, we have a better understanding of what people can know about language and what they can't know. So that sounds very abstract. Let me give you an example of how that works. If you take a simple expression like these 3 empty bottles, that's a noun, bottles, and then there are 3 elements that modify the noun, these, 3, and empty. And so you might expect that if you look at many languages that you find these 4 elements, the noun and the 3 modifiers, in all logically possible orders. So there will be 24 logically possible orders. But the fact of the matter is that despite people looking very hard, only 14 of these orders are ever found. And 10 orders seem to be systematically absent. So despite great efforts to find those orders. So the hypothesis that linguists in general adopt in this kind of situation is that those missing patterns are really impossible languages, and we try to understand why they're impossible. Okay, so there is a kind of pattern to what is present and what is absent. What are the possible patterns that we find and the impossible patterns that we find? So if you think about the noun and then the 3 modifiers, if the modifiers follow the noun, either all 3 or 2 of them, which happens in certain languages, then you find different orders. So following the noun you find cross-linguistic variation in word order. But preceding the noun, you always find the same word order. So if all 3 elements precede the noun, then you get the English word order, you get these 3 empty bottles, and not, for example, 3 these empty bottles or empty 3 these bottles. That kind of thing is just never found. And if 2 of them precede, you still get consistently always these before 3 if those 2 precede, or 3 before empty, and so on. So there's a kind of pattern to, it's not just that randomly some orders are absent, but there's a kind of pattern to what is present and what is absent in if you look at the set of all logically possible orders. And that suggests that it's possible to develop a theory of that. Okay, so there is a theory of that. There's a theory that is based on the idea that there is universally an order in which people like to combine modifiers with the noun. And then in addition to that, there's a limited set of permutations that languages can choose from to alter the order in certain ways. The actual theory is too complex to now explain, perhaps, but the basic idea is there's a kind of universal component that has to do with how you combine the modifiers with the noun, and there's a set of options, limited set of options that languages have to change order. And that seems to get exactly the right, exactly the typology that we found, namely 10 missing orders, 14 orders that exist. What is making life difficult and also interesting is that there are actually 2 versions of this theory. So there's the Venice version of the theory, and there's a London version of the theory. And at the moment the question is, what can we do to force a choice between those theories, so that we're closer to understanding. The more theories we eliminate, the closer we are to understanding what the pattern actually tells us. And obviously there's some hope that we can eliminate the Venice theory, right? So the plan for that, that's what I'm currently looking at, is to look at the opposite pattern to the pattern that I've just described. So the pattern that we just described had as a kind of signature that there was fixed word order preceding the noun and variable word order following the noun. It turns out under other circumstances you get exactly the opposite pattern. So variable word order preceding the noun and fixed word order following the noun. So a former colleague of John's, in English former precedes the noun and then of John's follows, but in many languages they come on the same side of the noun. It turns out that if both follow the noun, there's always ever one order, namely you have to say colleague former of John's. And there are no languages that say colleague of John's former. But if the two precede the noun, you get variable order, so you get both former of John's colleague or of John's former colleague. And so that's exactly the opposite pattern, and it turns out that the London version of the theory predicts that pattern can exist under very limited circumstances, whereas the Venice proposal essentially predicts that it can never exist. So at the moment the work is to try to figure out whether there's solid evidence supporting that generalization is correct, and if that's correct, I think we can build a case for UCL.